Alright, it's time for an update and forecast on the Boise fire. Reason I'm covering this one, we haven't seen much activity on the Park Fire or the Crozier fire recently, but this is what the Boise fire looked like yesterday. You see that big pyrocumulus cloud right there? And then it's also near a number of structures. This is also usually one of the boxes I check before I decide to do a wildfire forecast. And if we click on structures, you can see we do have some up here towards the northwest of the fire. But that's usually the first question that we try to answer when it comes to following a fire is where is the fire? And then we look at what is the current situation. And then we try to piece together kind of the foundation that we've built along with the weather forecast, what the topography looks like, what the fuels look like, to try to create a wildfire forecast to predict where this fire is going to go throughout the day today and then potentially over the next week or two, because it does look like there's some very rugged terrain in this area. So if you're only interested in one of these, I put each of these sections in the top of the comments with a timestamp. So if you only want the forecast, you can click straight to that. But without further ado, let's just try to figure out where is the fire, because I haven't seen a lot of coverage on this on kind of the major networks, maybe because it is in a bit more of a remote location. But so for that reason, it would be good to take the wide view here first. So you have Northern California, and then if we zoom in up to where you see these red spots right here, we have Orleans. So that's that cluster of structures that we were looking at towards the northwest of the fire. And then just some other kind of features that we can look at. It looks like we have Orleans Mountain right there. I believe that's Klamath River that goes up just to the east of Orleans. And then looks like we have Black Mountain down to the south. And then another good place to start is just looking at some of the current numbers on this. It's at 7,000 acres, 0% containment. And we have seen that acreage bump up recently. So that's another one of the reasons that I wanted to cover this, was because it had a lot of smoke coming off of it yesterday. Now, when it comes to those acreage and that increase in activity yesterday, I think the best way to see that is your fire progression map right here, where green is going to be when this fire started. Watch duty usually says 5 days ago, so August 9th at 10 a.m. That's where they created this report for the Boise fire. And then if you look at the red, that's going to be the growth that we had yesterday. So it looks like it was mostly up towards the north and then to the east as well. That looks like classic indication of a spot fire that then takes off to the east, most likely pushed by easterly winds or westerly winds. You name winds based on where they're coming from. And then I also notice indications of various firing operations here. Whenever you see weirdly shaped fire like that, it means that it's actually fire they're putting on the ground purposely to clear out the fuels, so that by the time the fire gets there, there's no more fuel for it to burn. Now we can actually look over here, and I'll just turn off and on the most recent perimeter we have so you can really zero in on where that growth was recently. Clearly, most of the growth was on this northern side, and that would be a little concerning at first glance, because that is the part of the fire that's decently close to where we have some structures here. One thing we can do is take out our ruler, and let's say from that part of the fire to Orleans, that's going to be about 2.74 miles. So that's a decent amount of distance, and one of the reasons that I actually feel good about that 2.5 miles is if you look at it, it's pretty steep downhill to get to Orleans from where we have some of the current fire. And fire likes to go uphill. That's a big part of the reason that we had as much growth as we did yesterday. You can see where the fire perimeter was yesterday. It established itself at the bottom of this canyon right here. So that was yesterday's perimeter. And then fire likes to go uphill. And we have some very steep terrain right here. The reason it likes to go uphill is it preheats the fuels above the fire, so that by the time the fire gets there, a lot of the moisture in the fuels has already been evaporated. And then the fire doesn't have to waste any of its energy evaporating that moisture out of the fuels. It's able to just take off uphill, and that's exactly what it did yesterday. Now, one other thing that we see on the west here is this firing operation that goes right along the ridge line. And that's actually good news as well, because hopefully that would mean it's good when they do this on a ridge, because that's kind of the point where you would want to stop it. It's where it loses some of its momentum because it's no longer just rushing up the hill, and then you hope that you can keep it from slopping over and going to the other side. But we'll most likely see that area right there fill in throughout the day today. And then over on this east side, I believe they're calling this Granite Drainage or Granite Creek Drainage. I'm still getting familiar with the area over here. And then going on and off here, yeah, it looks like we maybe had that spot fire that established right there. That's where a burning ember is picked up, dropped into some of the exceptionally dry fuels. And then it's interesting that even though it's downhill, we did see some significant growth on this eastern side yesterday. So that most likely tells us that the winds were pushing the fire in this direction. So I think we've established kind of where the fire is at this point. Now we could maybe go into our next bullet, which is what is the current situation on the Boise fire. So coming back here, one place I like to start with the current situation is what kind of personnel we have on the fire, because we've already seen some of the operations that they're doing. 610 personnel. And then largest amount of structures up here to the northwest, which is Orleans. But I think what I want to emphasize is exactly where that largest concern is, which would be the fire moving closer towards Orleans. Now, one, we have the firing operation, but thanks to a lot of the personnel that we have, which is 610, some of the other resources, 5 helicopters, 16 engines, only 2 dozers. So one thing that I will say, that's a very small amount of resources at the moment. I mean, we're used to looking at the Park Fire that had 6,500 personnel on it and over 100 dozers. But I did listen to the briefing this morning, and they did say there's more resources on the way, especially with that growth that we saw yesterday. But even with the limited resources that they have, they've been doing some pretty amazing work. So one is that firing operation that's hopefully going to contain the northwestern side of the fire right here. But then they've also put in a dozer line and a hand line. Now you're going to have to look pretty closely to see this. But the firing operation connects to where you see those black X's. That's where they have a dozer line. And then that connects to where you see that line with the H's. That's your hand line that ties in all the way to this western side of the fire. So we have Orleans up here towards the northwest, but they have cleared out fuels on this entire northwestern side of the fire, which is pretty impressive, especially given the limited resources that they have on this fire. So just coming back to Google Earth, this is where we're going to be able to see it a bit better. So firing operation on this ridge line, that's going to try to stop the fire right there throughout the day today. And then when I first looked at this perimeter, I was thinking, but the firing operation only goes right there. It could just creep right through here and then take off towards Orleans. But remember, that's where they have the dozer line along this ridge. And then they have a hand line as well that ties it in to where we haven't seen as much growth recently. And then so Google Earth is kind of acting up today. Bit slow. It's also probably because I have so many different links open. So remember, that's where we saw the growth yesterday rushing up towards the north. One thing that is going to slow it down now is that it's now going to be going downhill. But one thing I do notice, there's still a lot of fuel in this area, and the fuels are exceptionally dry as well, especially with that heat wave that we had at the beginning of July. That really dried things out, and it's easier for fire to spread when the fuels are dry, which I think everybody intuitively knows. One other thing I want to point out about some of the operations, it's not only that primary line where they have the firing operation, dozer line, hand line, but they've already been putting in some secondary dozer lines as well. And then I also heard in the briefing that they're actually going into the community and kind of doing some structure analysis and even some structure preparation if the worst were to happen and it were to spot over or just have enough momentum to move through where they've cleared out some of the fuels. But, I mean, again, on that side of the fire, it's going to have to move downhill in order to get to Orleans. So, let's say it did spot over that firing operation. It's going to have about 2.5 miles of steep downhill to go to, where it's going to have to evaporate all the moisture that's left in these fuels before it can continue to spread. So that's going to be a lot slower growth than the growth that we saw yesterday. And then also when it comes to kind of the current situation, one of the main things that we always look at is fire history. And I think that's something that's actually going to help us on this fire. So if we look at fire history, there's a lot of it around the fire. Notice no fire history where the fire has been burning. So not a big surprise that it's in 5 days it's gone up to over 7,000 acres, because there's a lot of fuel in here that hasn't burnt out in a very long time. Up towards the north, it looks like we have the Perch fire from 2023, so that's also going to provide some buffer there. Those fuels would have been recently burnt out. We have the 2013 Butler fire to the east. That's kind of pushing it for how much the fire can actually help you when it's more than 10 years old. And if you actually look on this east side, we've already seen the Boise fire go into that burn scar, and it did that fairly quickly. So that tells us that the Butler fire didn't clear out as much fuels as we would have liked, and there's enough fuel in this area for growth to continue. Notice though, not seeing many of those structured dots anywhere close on this east side. So not too worried there at the moment. And then it does look like we're getting some help from the 2020 red fire on the southern edge. I don't know if they're maybe reusing dozer lines or if it's just because this is where some of the fuels have cleared out. But where the fire, oh, it actually looks like, that looks like a firing operation right there. So it almost looks like they're trying to contain this southeastern side by connecting it to the, what year was that? 2020 red fire down here. So that will hopefully have a decent amount of fuels that have been burnt out recently. So it's kind of surrounded by fire history, although Butler doesn't seem to be helping too much. It's not great that we're not seeing any fire history between the Boise fire and Orleans, but we do have other things working for us, like the firing operation, the dozer line, and the fact that it's going to have to move downhill, and the weather forecast, which we'll get into in just one moment. But kind of wrapping up the current situation here, a lot of smoke over the fire. That's actually one good thing that can happen when you have a lot of acreage burn the day before, is you have a lot of smoke produced, and then it settles down over the fire overnight, and then that limits some of the heating that you get throughout the morning, because it's almost like you're just covered with a thick cloud, so the sunlight's not able to get through there as much. Does look like it's starting to clear out right now, though, and then we're starting to see perhaps a little bit more smoke start to be produced. But yesterday, the fire activity really picked up as the inversion lifted in the afternoon, expecting that once again today. And then final for current situation, let's just see what the current conditions are. So we have Orleans over here. I think this weather station is going to be the closest to where the fire is actually burning right now. There's Orleans Mountain. Shows a 10 mile per hour southwesterly wind. Notice it's only 55 degrees though. And what I love to see, max relative humidity 79%. So we had a lot of moisture move in overnight, which would have helped to calm the fire down, especially usually in your higher elevations, you don't get as good of a moisture recovery. I'm not exactly sure where this weather station is. I mean, it kind of looks like it's on a ridge right there. So if we had a 79% moisture recovery on a ridge, that would be great news for diminished activity throughout this morning. Min relative humidity 50%. So it's starting to drop now. But I mean, that's great. When we were on the park fire, there were some nights where the relative humidity was staying below 27% the entire night. Or there was one time we woke up at 6 in the morning and relative humidity was already 9%. So the moisture moving in certainly helps us. But it hasn't actually been weather that's been the key driver of this fire. Now, with that being said, it is now time to get into the wildfire forecast, and weather is the first thing that we're going to look at. The reason we're going to do that is because I don't actually think it's the major factor that's leading to the growth on this fire. So I kind of want to get it out of the way, and then we can try to answer the question, what is the major factor leading to growth on this fire? So it looks like some low 80s today. Depends on where you are on the fire. I've seen some other spots that look to be still in the 70s. Relative humidity not dropping that low. I'm actually curious to see what the relative humidity dropped to yesterday, because conditions today are fairly similar to yesterday. So relative humidity, it shows it dropped down to 11%. That shows 3%. Could that be right? Huh. That shows at about 2 to 5 in the morning. That's very interesting. Yesterday afternoon, it looked to be around maybe mid-20s. So I don't know how much we can trust that station. Those are some weird numbers right there. But just looking at what this forecast says for today, that's today, that's tonight, that's tomorrow. Today, warm, southwesterly wind. The direction of the wind is important because that usually determines where the fire is going to go. And then relative humidity dropping down from where it is right now, but doesn't look like it's going to be exceptionally dry. And then it looks like we have another good recovery overnight tonight. Now this map, or this chart, says that the winds are only going to be around 8 miles per hour. But one thing that we can do here is check with another source, because I've noticed the National Weather Service chart that what we were just looking at always tends to underestimate the winds, and then I've always noticed that this one tends to overestimate the winds, and that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So just zooming in here, that's the location we got for the fire. For example, it's saying 17 mile per hour winds right now, and we looked at the station on the ground, it was 10 mile per hour winds right now. So we already know that this one is overestimating. So when we get into the afternoon and it's showing some 25 to potentially even 30 mile per hour gusts, it's maybe we could subtract maybe 10 miles per hour from that, I would say. So still 15 to 20 mile per hour winds this afternoon. That's strong enough to lead to some growth. And it does look like it's coming from a very southwesterly and even westerly direction. That goes along with that growth that we had towards the northeast and towards the east yesterday. Think of what a southwesterly wind would do, push the fire towards the northeast and towards the east. But most of that growth towards the north yesterday was more about how much fuel we have in this area and the topography. Maybe some of that growth on the east, I would say, is mostly fuel driven. So the reason I say that is because when we come back to our fire history, well, there's a lot of fire history to the northeast and south of this fire, no fire history where the Boise fire is itself. So there's a lot of fuel that have been accumulating for decades, and it's been a very hot summer, so the fuel is quite dry at the moment. And then yesterday, we also want to open this back up and then just let the map reset itself. Yesterday, most of that growth towards the north was because at the beginning of the day, it was established down here in this canyon, and then it was able to rush uphill. So I'm actually not expecting as much growth on the north throughout the day today, because now it's going to have to go downhill on that side. But since our wind does look to be pretty southwesterly to even westerly, I am expecting more growth on this side of the fire right there, because that's still an area where you see how dark green that is. That's going to be where we have a lot of fuel. And then with that westerly wind, it's also going to try to push that spot fire and continue to push that towards the east. So that, I would say, is where we're going to see the growth throughout the day today. Just coming back out. Little bit more towards the north. We'll see how much it slops over the firing operation and that ridge throughout the day today, but should help us that it's a steep downhill from there. Should continue to see some growth on this northeastern side and this eastern side as well. Now, the one good thing is where we have the largest amount of structures, the fire is actually going to be pushing, or the winds are actually going to be pushing the fire away from that area. And then they're going to continue to use their resources to strengthen that firing operation, strengthen the dozer line that they have, and the hand line to make sure that this fire doesn't go towards Orleans. So overall, I would say we'll continue to see some activity today, especially once that inversion lifts this afternoon and a lot of the smoke clears out over the area, and then we start heating up and drying out a bit more. But it does look to be mostly driven by fuel and topography on this fire. And we still have plenty of that, especially on this northeastern section right there. So we'll most likely see growth in that area, but not expecting any huge threat to Orleans throughout the day today. So hopefully this video was helpful, and thanks for watching.